Wow, that's a really nice car.
Thank you, officer.
So where did you steal it from?
Excuse me?
Hands behind your back.
I'm a federal judge.
Yeah? And I'm Batman.
It started with a compliment. A cop saw a Ferrari, smiled, and said, "Nice car." Minutes later, that same officer had a black man in handcuffs, convinced the car had to be stolen. What he didn't know was that the man he arrested wasn't a criminal. He was a federal judge. What followed exposed how quickly authority turns dangerous when assumptions replace facts, and how one traffic stop ended up costing a city millions. Stay with this story to the end, because every second matters. And before we begin, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't just entertain, they reveal the truth. The patrol car rolled to a stop so smoothly it barely made a sound. No siren, no lights, just the quiet authority of a vehicle that knew it didn't need to announce itself to be obeyed. The officer stepped out, adjusted his belt, and let his eyes linger on the car. A Ferrari. Bright, flawless, expensive in a way that didn't whisper wealth, it shouted it. He whistled softly. "Such a nice car," the cop said, circling it slowly. His tone was casual, almost friendly. The kind of tone that disarms people. The kind that makes them forget they're being measured. The man behind the wheel rolled the window down halfway. Calm, controlled, no sudden movements. "Thanks, officer," he replied. The officer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in slightly, resting a hand on the roof as if testing whether the car was real. "How about you like it?" the officer asked. The question landed heavier than it sounded. The man paused for half a second, just long enough to notice the shift. He'd heard that tone before. Not admiration, evaluation. "It drives well," he said evenly. "Handles better than most people expect." The officer chuckled. A short laugh. Forced. "Yeah." He straightened up and glanced around the empty parking lot. No witnesses. No cameras obvious enough to worry about. Must have taken a lot to get something like this. The man nodded. It did. Another pause. The officer's gaze hardened. His eyes moved from the Ferrari badge to the man's face. Then back again, as if the two didn't belong in the same frame. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" the officer asked. The man answered without hesitation. Clear, polite, lawful. But the officer wasn't listening anymore. In his head, a different story had already started playing. A story he thought he'd seen 100 times. He tapped the hood lightly with his knuckles. "Tap, tap. Step out of the vehicle for me," he said. The tone had changed, and the man noticed. As he opened the door and stepped out, he had no idea that this moment, this casual stop, this fake compliment, was about to spiral into something that would shake an entire city. Because the officer didn't just see a man. He saw a problem that needed to be controlled. And control, once tasted, is hard to let go. The man stood beside the Ferrari, hands relaxed at his sides. No resistance, no attitude. He knew the rules. He'd lived by them his entire life. The officer, however, had already decided the rules were flexible. "So," the cop said, slowly pacing around him now, boots crunching softly on gravel. "This your car?" "Yes," the man replied. One word. Firm. Clean. The officer stopped walking. "Your car," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Registered to you?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. The officer tilted his head slightly, studying the man's face like a detective in a cheap crime show. Then he smirked. "You don't really look like someone who owns a car like this." There it was. The line. The sentence that wasn't supposed to mean anything, but meant everything. The man felt it in his chest. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. The same recognition you feel when a storm cloud moves directly over your head. "What does someone who owns a Ferrari look like?" he asked calmly. The officer exhaled through his nose, amused. "You know what I mean?" "No," the man said. "I don't." The silence stretched. The officer's hand hovered closer to his radio now. Not because he needed backup, but because power feels better when it's visible. "Where did you get the money for this car?" the officer asked. The man blinked once. Slowly. "That's not a lawful question," he replied. The smile vanished. "Watch your tone," the officer snapped. "I'm being very patient with you." The man nodded. "And I'm cooperating." The officer took a step closer. Too close. Inside personal space. A move meant to intimidate. Step back, the man said quietly. You're making this confrontational for no reason. That was the moment. The officer's jaw tightened. His ego, now bruised, demanded repayment. Hand behind your back, he said suddenly. The man froze, not out of fear but disbelief. For what reason? He asked. Failure to comply. The officer shot back instantly. Too fast, too rehearsed, and suspicion of vehicle theft. The words hit like a slap. The man's heart rate increased, but his voice stayed steady. Officer, this vehicle is legally mine. I have not committed a crime. Turn around, the officer ordered, already reaching for the cuffs. A small crowd had begun to form, drivers slowing down, people pretending not to stare while staring anyway. The man exhaled. He knew exactly how this would look. A black man. A Ferrari. Handcuffs. History had taught him this picture too well. I'm not resisting, he said clearly, placing his hand behind his back. But you are making a serious mistake. The officer scoffed as metal clicked shut around the man's wrists. Yeah, he said. I hear that a lot. As he tightened the cuffs, just a little more than necessary, the man winced. You'll regret this, the man said. Not as a threat, as a statement of fact. The officer leaned and closed his ear. Sure I will, he whispered. And I'm the president. The man looked straight ahead. Actually, he said calmly, I'm a federal judge. The officer laughed out loud. A real laugh this time. Yeah, he said, guiding the man toward the patrol car. And I'm Batman. But what the officer didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that every second of this encounter was being recorded. And somewhere, far away, a courtroom was waiting. The back door of the patrol car opened with a hollow thud. The officer guided the man forward, one hand gripping his arm, the other pushing his head down. Not because it was necessary, but because it felt familiar. Procedural muscle memory mixed with something uglier. Watch your head, the officer said flatly, a second too late. The man ducked anyway and slid into the back seat. The cuffs bit into his wrists as he adjusted himself, the hard plastic seat offering no comfort. The door slammed shut. Click. Locked. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the officer walked around the car slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. He leaned in through the open front window. So, he said, glancing back at the Ferrari one more time, a federal judge, huh? Yes, the man replied. Calm. Controlled. Appointed 8 years ago. The officer snorted. Funny. You don't look like one. The man closed his eyes for a brief second. Not to pray. To center himself. You can verify my identity, he said. My name is... Save it, the officer interrupted, starting the engine. You can tell it to the desk sergeant. The car pulled away. As the patrol vehicle merged onto the road, the Ferrari disappeared from view, left behind like evidence already judged guilty. The man stared out the small, reinforced window. Reflections of streetlights streaked across the glass as they drove. He had been in cars like this before, not as a suspect, but as an observer, as a man who understood the system from the inside. That knowledge made this worse. Much worse. You know, the officer said casually, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his radio. People like you always say you're someone important. People like me? The man asked. The officer shrugged. You know, big talkers. Fake credentials. Think flashing a title will get you out of trouble. The man leaned forward slightly. Officer, you are detaining a sitting federal judge without probable cause. The officer glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a fraction of a second, doubt flickered across his face. Then it vanished. Uh-huh, he said. And I'm sure you'll tell the court all about how mean I was to you. The man's voice dropped lower. Sharper. This is not about being mean. This is about abuse of authority. That word hit harder than expected. The officer's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Careful, he said. You're starting to sound hostile. I'm stating facts, the man replied. And facts don't disappear just because you don't like them. The officer hit the brakes harder than necessary at a red light. You want to make this worse? He snapped, turning halfway around in his seat. Because I can make this much worse. The man met his eyes through the mirror. You already have. The light turned green. The car moved again. What the officer didn't realize was that this wasn't just an arrest. It was documentation. Every word, every tone shift, every unnecessary escalation. And somewhere, maybe tonight, maybe months from now, 12 jurors would hear this story in a quiet courtroom. Not through anger, not through accusation, but through cold, undeniable evidence. And when they did, the question wouldn't be who owned the Ferrari. It would be who abused the badge. The patrol car rolled into the station lot and stopped abruptly. The engine idled. For a moment, the officer just sat there, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping impatiently against the door. He was irritated now, not excited, not confident. Irritated. The kind of irritation that comes when a situation doesn't feel as clean as it did 5 minutes ago. Sit tight, he muttered, opening the door. The man watched through the narrow window as the officer stepped out and shut the door harder than necessary. The station loomed ahead, concrete, fluorescent lights, the smell of bureaucracy and stale coffee waiting inside. The back door opened again. Out, the officer said. The man stepped onto the pavement carefully. The cuffs pulled at his shoulders. A couple of other officers glanced over. One raised an eyebrow at the Ferrari-less suspect in a tailored jacket and dress shoes. Not the usual intake. What's he in for? One of them asked casually. Auto theft, the arresting officer replied quickly. Too quickly. The man turned his head. That is false. Didn't ask you, the officer snapped, gripping his arm again and steering him inside. The front desk buzzed with low conversation and keyboard taps. A civilian clerk looked up. Name, she asked. The officer opened his mouth. Before he could speak, the man did. My name is... Don't, the officer cut in sharply. You'll speak when spoken to. The clerk looked between them. Something in her expression shifted. Not sympathy, curiosity. The man inhaled slowly. I'm a federal judge. You may verify my credentials immediately. The room went quiet. Not dead silent, but quiet enough. A nearby officer stopped mid-sentence. Another glanced over from the coffee machine. The arresting officer laughed, loud and exaggerated. Here we go. The clerk hesitated. Sir, are you saying you're a judge? Yes, the man replied. United States District Court. The officer leaned over the counter. He's lying. Happens all the time. The clerk didn't type anything yet. Do you have identification? Yes, the man said. In my wallet. Front right pocket. The officer shook his head. We'll inventory that later. That would be a mistake, the man said calmly. I am requesting that a supervisor be present immediately. The officer's smile faded. You don't get to make requests. I do, the man replied, and you are obligated to honor them. Now the doubt came back, stronger this time. Another officer stepped closer. Hey, you want me to grab a sergeant? No, the arresting officer snapped. I've got this. But his voice cracked slightly. The clerk cleared her throat. Protocol says if someone claims judicial office, I said I've got this. The officer repeated louder. The man met his eyes. Every second you delay verification increases your liability. That word again. Liability. The officer turned away abruptly. Put him in holding. The man didn't resist as he was led down the hallway. The door buzzed open. Cold metal bench. A holding cell meant for drunks and disorderly conduct. Not someone who had sentenced men like this officer before. The door shut. Buzz. Click. Alone now, the man finally allowed himself to sit. Not in defeat. In patience. Because he knew something the officer didn't. This wasn't going away. And somewhere in the building, a supervisor was about to walk into a problem with a very expensive ending. Minutes passed. Then 10 more. Time moved differently inside holding. Every sound echoed. The buzz of doors, distant laughter, the scrape of boots on tile. The man sat upright, hands still cuffed, eyes forward. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calculating. Down the hall, the arresting officer stood near the desk, pretending to scroll through his phone. In reality, he was listening, waiting, hoping this would blow over. It didn't. A door opened. Sergeant Miller, someone called out. The sergeant stepped into view. Mid-40s, tired eyes, the posture of someone who'd seen too many bad calls turn worse. He glanced at the clipboard in the clerk's hand. What's this? He asked. The clerk lowered her voice. The detainee is claiming he's a federal judge. The officer scoffed loudly. Yeah, and I'm telling you he's full of it. The sergeant looked at him. Just looked. No reaction. Then he turned to the clerk. Did we verify? No, sir. Officer said not to. That was enough. The sergeant exhaled slowly. Bring me his ID. The arresting officer stiffened. Sarge, come on. This guy. Now the sergeant said. Quiet. Final. They walked to holding. The door buzzed open. The man stood as they approached, posture straight despite the cuffs. Sir, the sergeant said, measured professional. State your name. The man did. The sergeant blinked. Just once. Then he asked again, slower. The man repeated it. The sergeant turned slightly, shielding his face from the officer, and pulled out his phone. 30 seconds. That's all it took. The color drained from his face. He looked up at the man, then back at the officer. Why is a sitting federal judge in my holding cell? He asked. The officer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The sergeant didn't raise his voice. Didn't yell. That made it worse. Cuffs off, he said. Immediately. The officer hesitated. Sarge, Now. The cuffs came off. The man rolled his wrists once calmly. I requested verification over 30 minutes ago, he said. You declined. The sergeant swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. That word hit the room like a dropped weight. The officer took a step back. The sergeant straightened his uniform. Sir, on behalf of this department, The judge raised a hand. Don't, he said. Not yet. Silence. Before we talk apologies, the judge continued. I want every body camera preserved. Immediately. No deletions. No edits. Yes, Your Honor. I also want the arrest report exactly as it was originally written. The officer's eyes widened, and the judge added, turning his gaze directly to the man who had cuffed him, I want his supervisor present. The officer finally found his voice. This was a misunderstanding. The judge's tone hardened for the first time. No, he said. This was an assumption. The room felt smaller, because everyone now understood the truth. This story wasn't ending at the station. It was just beginning. The lieutenant arrived 10 minutes later. Not walking, marching. His expression was tight, jaw set, eyes already scanning the room for damage control before anyone had even spoken. He stopped when he saw the judge standing near the desk. Uncuffed, composed, unmistakably out of place in a police station. Your Honor, the lieutenant said immediately. The arresting officer felt his stomach drop. The judge turned slowly. Lieutenant. The sergeant handed over the phone, still open to the federal judiciary profile. The lieutenant didn't need to look. He already knew. I want to begin by apologizing, the lieutenant said. This situation is not a situation, the judge interrupted. Calm. Surgical. It is an unlawful detention. The word landed with precision. The lieutenant nodded. Yes, sir. The arresting officer shifted his weight. Sweat had started to form at his temples. He had replayed the stop in his head already, trying to find the moment where he could justify it. There wasn't one. I was stopped, the judge continued, without probable cause. I was questioned unlawfully. I was handcuffed, transported, and placed in holding, all after identifying myself and requesting verification. The lieutenant turned sharply to the officer. Is that accurate? The officer swallowed. I believe the vehicle was stolen. Based on what? The lieutenant asked. The officer opened his mouth. Closed it. Answer the question, the lieutenant said. The room waited. The officer finally said it, quiet, defensive, exposed. It didn't make sense. The judge tilted his head slightly. Didn't make sense to whom? Silence again. The lieutenant exhaled. Slowly. Officer, step outside. The officer hesitated. Lieutenant. Outside. Now. The door closed behind them. Inside, the lieutenant turned back to the judge. Sir, we will cooperate fully with any review or investigation. The judge nodded. Good. Then he added, because there will be several. The lieutenant's shoulders dropped just a fraction. I am not here for revenge, the judge said. I am here for accountability. He paused. And accountability is expensive when delayed. No one argued. The judge adjusted his jacket, glanced once more around the station, and spoke his final sentence like a verdict already written. I expect to hear from the city's legal department within 48 hours. Yes, Your Honor. As he walked out, escorted respectfully this time, the station felt different. Quieter. Heavier. because everyone understood what had just happened. This wasn't an apology moment. It was a pre-trial moment. And somewhere downtown, a city attorney was about to receive a call that would ruin their week. The judge didn't drive his Ferrari home that night. He didn't need to. A city-issued sedan followed him instead. Quiet, apologetic, unnecessary. He declined conversation, declined explanations, declined the lieutenant's rehearsed remorse. He had work to do. By morning, the calls began. First, the city attorney's office. Then, internal affairs. Then, a deputy chief who spoke too fast and said too little. By noon, the judge's chambers were silent, except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the faint clicking of a pen against legal paper. He reviewed the body cam footage once. That was enough. The compliment, the pause, the assumption, the cuffs, the laugh. And I'm Batman. He wrote a single sentence in the margin of his notes. Pattern behavior, not isolated error. Across town, the arresting officer sat in an interview room with a recorder blinking red. How often, the investigator asked, do you stop vehicles like that? The officer hesitated. How often, the investigator repeated. Do you stop people like that? Silence doesn't lie. It only delays the truth. By evening, the mayor's office had been briefed. By nightfall, the police union had called. By midnight, the city's insurer had quietly opened a file. And by sunrise, a decision had already been made before a single lawsuit was filed. Settle early. Settle quietly. Hope no one notices. They underestimated one thing. The judge had spent his entire career noticing. The lawsuit landed like a controlled detonation. No press conference. No dramatic filing. Just a clean, methodical complaint. Pages of facts, timestamps, policies violated, constitutional standards ignored. It read less like outrage and more like instruction. Discovery began immediately. And that's when the city realized this wasn't just about one stop. Emails surfaced, training records, prior complaints, dismissed, minimized, unsubstantiated. Body cam footage from other stops with the same officer. Same tone, same pattern, different drivers. Always the pause, always the question, always the assumption. The judge's legal team didn't grandstand. They asked for everything. Internal memos, shift logs, performance reviews, disciplinary histories. The city stalled, then complied, then regretted it, because the data told a story the city had spent years trying not to hear. Across the table, the city attorney rubbed his temples as the projector played clip after clip. Not the Ferrari stop. Worse ones, louder ones, angrier ones. This is indefensible, someone whispered. The attorney didn't respond. He already knew. The deposition room was smaller than the courtroom the judge usually commanded, but the power dynamics were unmistakable. The arresting officer sat stiffly at the table, hands folded, jaw tight. A court reporter adjusted her machine. Lawyers arranged their files with deliberate slowness. Every movement carried weight. State your name for the record, the attorney said. The officer did. Do you recall stopping a red Ferrari on the evening of? Yes. Why? The officer cleared his throat. Suspicious behavior. What behavior, specifically? The officer paused. Too long. I asked you a question, the attorney said calmly. I had a feeling, the officer answered. The judge, seated quietly at the far end of the room, didn't react. He didn't need to. The transcript would do the work for him. A feeling, the attorney repeated. Based on what training? Silence. Based on what observable facts? More silence. The attorney leaned forward. Is it fair to say your suspicion arose before any traffic violation? Yes. And before any report of a stolen vehicle matching that description? Yes. And before you ran the plates? Yes. The room felt heavier with every answer. So, the attorney concluded, your suspicion was not based on evidence, but assumption. The officer looked toward his own counsel. They didn't look back. The deposition did not end with the last question. That was the mistake the officer made, thinking silence meant safety. Once the recorder stopped, the room stayed quiet for several seconds longer than necessary. No one rushed to stand. No one checked their phone. Even the court reporter hesitated before packing up, as if she sensed the gravity of what had just been captured, because the words were now permanent, not alleged, not interpreted, recorded. The officer shifted in his chair. His confidence, the kind that had carried him through countless stops, was gone, replaced with something unfamiliar: exposure. The city's attorney cleared his throat. "We'll be requesting a short recess before continuing," he said, already knowing it wouldn't help. The judge stood slowly, not to intimidate, to end the moment. "I'll make myself available," he said, "as long as necessary." That sentence alone told the city everything it needed to know. When the deposition resumed later that afternoon, the questions sharpened. "Officer," the attorney began, "how many Ferrari stops have you conducted in your career?" The officer frowned. "I don't keep track." "More than 5? "Yes." "More than 10? "Yes." "And in how many of those stops was the driver arrested?" The officer hesitated. His lawyer shifted in his seat. "Answer the question," the attorney said evenly. "Most of them." The room froze. "Most," the attorney repeated. "So you're testifying that in the majority of high-end vehicle stops you conducted, the drivers were arrested?" "Yes." "And how many of those arrests resulted in stolen vehicle confirmations?" The officer's voice dropped. "Very few." The attorney nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. "So the arrest came first. The evidence came later, if at all." No response. "Officer," the attorney said, "do you believe wealth has a look?" The officer's eyes flicked to the judge for half a second. "A fatal instinct. I believe experience teaches you patterns." "Patterns," the attorney echoed. "Let's talk about patterns." He slid a document across the table. "Do you recognize this?" The officer scanned it. His face tightened. "That's a complaint. One of 18, the attorney replied. "Filed against you over the last 6 years." The officer looked up sharply. "Most were dismissed." "Yes," the attorney said calmly. "Without investigation." The judge finally spoke. "Dismissed complaints do not equal false complaints," he said. The words landed like a gavel. By the end of the week, the city's posture had changed. What began as damage control had evolved into survival strategy. Internal emails began circulating, flagged urgent, marked confidential, filled with phrases like risk exposure and pattern liability. The police chief requested emergency meetings. The mayor's chief of staff demanded updates every 4 hours. The numbers were being calculated now, not emotionally, financially. How much would it cost if this went to trial? How many similar cases would follow once this one became public? How many officers would be exposed once discovery widened? The answer was clear. Too many. The settlement offer came quietly. No cameras, no announcements, just a formal letter delivered by hand. 7 figures, with language that included no admission of wrongdoing. The judge read it once, then slid it back across the table. "No." The city attorney blinked. "Your Honor, this is generous." The judge met his eyes. "It's insufficient. May I ask what you're seeking?" The judge didn't hesitate. "Policy reform, mandatory retraining, independent oversight, and public accountability." The attorney leaned back slowly. "That will open the city up to—" "Yes," the judge interrupted. "That's the point." The arresting officer learned about the rejected settlement from his union representative. "What does that mean for me?" he asked. The rep didn't answer immediately. "That depends," he said finally, "on how much more comes out." More came out. Text messages, off-duty conversations, jokes shared in group chats, language that never made it into reports, but lived comfortably in private. The union went silent. Internal affairs reopened cases. Supervisors were suspended. Training officers were reassigned. The badge that once felt invincible now felt heavy. 3 weeks later, the city folded. The settlement was revised. 8 figures. Public acknowledgement. Federal oversight. Mandatory body cam audits. Officer termination for cause. And a clause no one expected. A recorded statement from the officer. On the record. Under oath. The judge agreed. The room was full when the officer sat down. Cameras rolling. Lawyers watching. Officials holding their breath. "State your name," the moderator said. The officer did. "Do you acknowledge that your actions during the stop were unlawful?" "Yes." "Do you acknowledge that your assumptions played a role in that decision?" The officer swallowed. "Yes." "And do you acknowledge that those assumptions were influenced by race?" The silence stretched longer than any pause before. Yes, the officer said finally. The sound of it echoed far beyond the room. The city paid. The officer was terminated. Training standards changed. Policies were rewritten. But the most important shift wasn't procedural. It was psychological, because every officer in that department now knew something they hadn't before. A badge does not protect you from the truth, and a Ferrari does not make a man guilty. They called it a hearing. That word was intentional. Smaller, quieter, less dangerous than trial. But everyone involved knew the truth. This was a public reckoning in everything but name. The courtroom filled early, not with reporters, yet, but with lawyers, policy advisors, civil rights observers, and a few officers who sat stiffly in the back rows, arms crossed, faces unreadable. The judge entered last. Not that judge, another one. And that distinction mattered, because for the first time in his career, the man who had sentenced others would sit on the opposite side of the room, not as defendant, not as victim, but as evidence. The city's attorney stood first. "We believe this matter can be resolved without prolonged proceedings," he said smoothly. The opposing counsel didn't even look up. "We disagree." 2 words. That was all it took. They played the body cam footage in full. Not edited, not summarized. Every second, the courtroom watched the compliment turn into suspicion. The suspicion turn into authority. The authority turn into force. No commentary, no narration, just sound. When the officer laughed, "And I'm Batman," someone in the gallery inhaled sharply. The judge on the bench didn't react, but the court reporter's fingers slowed for half a beat. The officer took the stand again, this time under public oath. "Officer," the attorney said, "did the defendant raise his voice at any point during the stop?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Did he refuse any lawful order?" "No." "Then explain, clearly, why he was handcuffed." The officer stared straight ahead. "I felt unsafe." The attorney nodded. "Because—" The officer's voice dropped. The situation escalated. Escalated by whom? Silence. The judge on the bench leaned forward slightly. "Answer," she said. The officer swallowed. "By me." That admission landed heavier than any accusation. When it was time for the federal judge to testify, the room shifted. He didn't dramatize, didn't emote, didn't accuse. He explained. He explained how many times he had presided over cases involving similar stops. How often officers described feelings instead of facts. How frequently the system rewarded confidence over correctness. "I was not offended," he said calmly. "I was reminded." The courtroom stayed silent. "I was reminded that authority, when unchecked, does not need malice to cause harm. It only needs permission." No one objected. They couldn't. Before closing arguments could begin, the city requested a private conference. The judge allowed it. Behind closed doors, voices rose. Not angry, panicked. The numbers had changed. The optics had shifted. The risk had multiplied. When the doors reopened, the city attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight, "the city moves to accept all proposed reforms and requests immediate settlement acknowledgement." The opposing counsel nodded once. The judge on the bench looked at the federal judge. "Do you accept?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked around the courtroom, at the officers, at the lawyers, at the empty seats where the public would eventually sit. "Yes," he said, "but this record stays public." The city hesitated, then nodded. The story broke that afternoon, not with headlines about money, but about policy, about precedent, about a single stop that forced a system to explain itself. The Ferrari was mentioned only once, and never again. Change never arrives with sirens. It arrives quietly, disguised as memos, policy updates, revised manuals that most people skim and forget. That's how departments survive scandals, not by denying them, but by burying them under procedure. This time was different, because this time the paper trail had teeth. Within 30 days, every patrol officer in the city was ordered into mandatory retraining. Not the usual 2-hour slideshow, not a checkbox course. 8 full days, scenario-based, recorded, reviewed by independent monitors. Officers were required to justify stops out loud, in real time, with articulable facts. No feelings, no vibes. No, it didn't look right. And the footage wasn't just archived. It was audited, randomly, relentlessly, without warning. Some officers adapted. Others struggled. A few resigned quietly before they could be exposed. That was the first crack. For years, there had been an unspoken rule inside the department. Protect your own. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It lived in side glances, closed-door conversations, and phrases like handle it at the lowest level. The lawsuit shattered that rule, not because of fear of punishment, but because fear had changed direction. Now, silence carried risk. Covering for someone else meant attaching your name to their future deposition, their text messages, their past complaints. Suddenly, doing the right thing was immoral. It was strategic, and strategy changes behavior faster than ethics ever will. The former officer didn't give interviews. He didn't write a statement. He disappeared from public view with the same speed he'd once appeared at traffic stops. But the consequences followed him anyway. No department would touch him. No private security firm would return his calls. His certification was flagged, permanently annotated with language that didn't accuse but warned. He took a job outside law enforcement. Low visibility, low authority, low margin for ego. People like to believe that consequences are dramatic. They're not. They're quiet, cumulative, and permanent. The federal judge refused every invitation to speak. Panels, universities, media. No, he said again and again, until one request landed differently. A closed-door session. No cameras, just recruits, first-year officers. He stood in front of them without a robe. "I'm not here to scare you," he said, "and I'm not here to lecture you." He paused. "I'm here to tell you something no one told you early enough." The room was silent. "Authority does not mean correctness," he said, "and confidence does not mean justification." He let that sit. "If you rely on instinct more than evidence," he continued, "you will eventually hurt the wrong person. And when you do, the system will not protect you." No applause. No questions. Just understanding. 6 months later, they began. Other cities. Other stops. Other luxury cars. Different facts. Same patterns. Attorneys cited the case. Not for the money, but for the language. The admissions. The precedent. Departments settled faster now. Too fast, some said. But speed is what happens when the math stops working. Despite everything, not everyone changed. Some officers adapted just enough to avoid cameras. Some learned new words to dress old instincts. Some waited patiently for attention to fade. Because systems don't collapse all at once. They erode. And erosion takes time. The judge knew that. That's why he never called it a victory. 1 year later, the Ferrari appeared again. Same model, same color, different street. An officer noticed it, paused, watched it pass, then looked down at his dash camera, and kept driving. Not because the driver was untouchable, but because this time there was nothing to justify the stop. That was the real change. The judge never spoke about the case again. Not because it was painful, not because it was personal, but because some truths lose their power when repeated too often. He returned to his courtroom the following Monday like nothing had happened. Same bench, same flag, same quiet rhythm of cases that never made headlines. Defendants stood. Lawyers argued. Decisions were rendered. Order continued. From the outside, it looked unchanged. From inside, it wasn't. He noticed it in the pauses, in the way officers chose their words more carefully, in how reports grew longer, slower, more deliberate. Fear hadn't entered the room. Awareness had. And awareness, unlike fear, doesn't fade quickly. Some nights, driving home, he passed the same streets where the stop had happened. The same lights. The same intersections. The same quiet places where power once acted without witnesses. He never slowed down. He didn't need to. The city had already learned what he wanted it to learn. That the law does not bend for convenience. That authority is not ownership. That dignity does not require permission. The Ferrari remained just a car. Parked, driven, maintained, ignored, exactly as it should have been from the start. It no longer symbolized suspicion. It no longer carried a story. It became background noise in a city full of louder lessons. The officer who replaced the one who made the stop was younger. Careful, almost hesitant. He watched people's hands. He asked questions slowly. He wrote reports like they would be read aloud one day, because he knew they might be. That knowledge followed him everywhere, quietly. Years later, when the case was taught, not in headlines but in training rooms, it was reduced to bullet points and legal language. Unlawful detention, lack of probable cause, improper escalation, clean, clinical, incomplete. What the slides never captured was the moment between the compliment and the cuffs. That invisible second where a choice is made. That's where everything changes. The judge understood that better than anyone. That's why he never called the case justice. Justice suggests an ending. This wasn't an ending. It was a correction, a recalibration, a reminder that systems don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, one assumption at a time. And so the story doesn't stop. It just lowers its voice. It moves into training rooms, patrol cars, court transcripts, and moments where someone decides to think instead of assume, to verify instead of accuse, to pause instead of act. That's how it ends. Not with punishment, not with applause, not with a period, but with a moment that doesn't happen, a stop that isn't made, a hand that doesn't reach for cuffs, a judgment that waits for facts, in a city that, for once, keeps moving forward because someone chose not to pull over.